afternoon, everyone. I trust you can all hear me loud and clear. My name is John Philo with Trinity Consultants. I'm a principal consultant in Trinity's EH&S Information Technology Solutions business. And today we will go through a somewhat brief orientation on API SANGEA version 4.1, the newly issued version, for greenhouse gas emissions accounting and reporting. Okay. There we go. The slides work. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to work with Trinity in the past, I just want to give you a minute here on Trinity and who we are. We started our business in 1974 with one office in Dallas within our quality specialty, and over the last almost 40 years now have over 35 U.S. offices, as well as offices in China, in the Middle East, in Bahrain and Doha, the UK, and in Canada. We provide environmental and business solutions for industry, and the firm is certified ISO 9001 quality management system. We use that as a mechanism to ensure the veracity with which we conduct our business and how we bring quality to our clients.
Apparently we're pretty big in that.
Our services and products basically work around the area of environmental consulting, air quality and overall environmental health and safety regulatory compliance, sustainability and environmental management, EH&S compliance auditing. We, in the last couple of years, have added to our business a company known as SafeBridge, who does work predominantly in the pharmaceutical industries in the area of industrial hygiene, analytical chemistry, and toxicology. We do work in the area of environmental health and safety information management solutions, as I mentioned earlier, both as implementation partners with developers of software solutions, as well as in developing custom solutions for our clients and pocket solutions as well. We sell software, basically Breeze, our air quality modeling software, and we do an extensive amount of professional training, both individual to companies as well as public courses and webinars such as what we're going through here today. The T3 business basically focuses on enterprise-wide environmental management information systems, custom solutions, and pocket solutions, as I indicated. The business has been operating within Trinity since 1995. The agenda for our webinar today is pretty straightforward. We'll give a brief overview of SANGEA 4.1, then kind of step through at a high level the SANGEA setup process, just so you can see the various elements of how you go through to set up SANGEA files in the system. And then we will do a brief demo of SANGEA 4.1 to kind of show you some of the information and data and reporting that one can actually do. API has sponsored the development of SANGEA. I guess they've been involved with this probably going on 10 years or more. They've sponsored the effort, and in so doing, to promote a standardized greenhouse gas emissions accounting and reporting approach for the industry. The software was originally developed by Chevron, I guess around 2000 plus or minus. It was donated to API and has gone through several revisions, the current revision being 4.1. This current revision contains a complete overhaul from the previous spreadsheet version, version 3, and it also includes both the API Compendium 2009 and relevant EPA mandatory reporting rule subparts for the petroleum industries. In some respects, the software is similar to Tanks 4.09 in that it uses Access as a core database for handling the information, but the user interface obviously is much more complex because of the wide range of emission sources and such that are part of the software. SANGEA 4.1 is there to assist industry in recording and benchmarking consistent and comparable data. API continues to do benchmarking around GHG emissions for the oil and gas industry, and thus this is one mechanism for companies to be able to provide that information for API's benchmarking. Brief overview, SANGEA 4.1, it's a desktop application. It is built in Microsoft.NET framework and uses an access database to store source information and activity data that is input into the system. It also uses Microsor Reporting Services to develop reports of the emission inventories, and also has the ability to import and export data as well. Similar to SANGEA 3, it's designed to report emissions for an entity with emissions from multiple locations. So while one can take information to, you can report data at the entity level depending upon how you set the files up, it also allows you to report data specific to each location that you've entered into the system. It is designed to assist petroleum companies with estimating, managing, and reporting emissions, and also reports the emissions not just on an absolute basis, but also it can normalize greenhouse gas emissions based on either energy consumption and or production information which is entered into the system as it is developed. The system also includes US EPA AP-42 emission factors for calculating criteria pollutant emissions if the user wishes to actually do this. This slide shows an overview of the SANGEA architecture. It's organized to handle fuels, emission sources, and activities associated with those emission sources. The main views basically, one second, just lost my train of thought here. Let me gain it back. The data information is organized by fuels, sources, and activities. So fuel properties and emission factors, sources, the various emission modules that are inherent in the system itself, and basically the activities that include fuel data, data for single emission sources, data from multi-sources, which will explain kind of the distinction in a little bit, sources that may be non-routine events, and source emission data. Data can be imported and exported from the system using Excel spreadsheets and, if properly programmed, other access databases. With the information contained in the system, one can then calculate emissions, and then a variety of different kinds of reports can, in fact, be accessed and utilized for the purpose of reporting emissions from your operations and locations. This slide shows an overview of the various SANGEA source modules. There are a total of 16 modules, as is illustrated in the list on the left, and it shows how these map into both the API Compendium 2009 as well as the various EPA MRR subparts. So for subpart C, stationary combustion, subpart P for hydrogen plants, subpart W for oil and gas operations, as well as subpart Y for petroleum refineries. It provides a comprehensive coverage of source modules so that an entity can, in fact, develop and report their emissions. This is a kind of a screenshot of the main view of software. You'll get to see this a little bit later on once we step through the process. Basically shows the system at a glance. Entity information, under the system part, entity information, information on users that might access the software to actually develop emission estimates, locations, the locations within your organization that are going to in fact calculate emissions for, fuels that are used in your various operations, and then the actual emission sources. It also contains data input elections for fuel properties. For location production, remember, you're not just calculating your greenhouse gas emissions, but you also have the ability to report the emissions on a normalized basis. Data input for multi-sources. Again, these are multi-sources or sources where there are multiple sources of the same type, and we'll talk about that just a little later. Single source events that may happen on a non-routine basis that have to be included in quantifying greenhouse gas inventory, and then ultimately source emissions. With that brief overview, what we're going to do next is to step through the SANGEA setup process, somewhat at a high level, but at least to give you a flavor of what it's going to take to actually set up and organize your greenhouse gas inventory in such a way that you can then calculate your emissions and thus report those emissions. The first step really is one that is set up to allow you to select some overall preferences for how you want your data developed within the system. It works off of either 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 68 degrees Fahrenheit standard conditions that's used for emission calculations. In effect, this is probably should be most aligned to what it is that you do and how you collect and aggregate your data so that information as input will be consistent with one of those conditions. Now, we're trying to avoid confusion of the standard condition, but also the fact is that the software itself has converted emission factors that covers both standard conditions. Now, if you're doing following the API Compendium, those are largely, in fact, entirely based on 60 degrees Fahrenheit. USEPA MRR has some mixed standards included in the protocol, and as such, it will use the emission factors that are appropriate based upon the conditions that the data is input in. Again, you have the ability, the way this is set up is this input is governed by a wizard-based data input screen. So in effect, as you start to set up your file, the wizard will walk you through the various screens that have the information requirements on them, and you simply go through and add in the information as it's requested by the wizard. This also initializes the database structure for developing your locations, your sources, the source modules, and putting in your activity data. You also have the ability to determine whether you want to include criteria pollutants in the calculation routine. SANGEA 4.1 includes calculation methods that are derived from US EPA's AP-42 or user-specified emission factors which can, in fact, be input into the system. If you decide to calculate criteria pollutant emissions, the wizard will identify additional questions that will then allow you to input the information necessary. One of the items that comes up as part of the overall preferences is actually the global warming potentials for both methane and N2O. Now, my understanding is EPA is considering modifications to or updating the global warming potentials. Even though the standard potentials from previous year's inventories are currently in the system, it's very simple to change that during the setup so that, in fact, the CO2e equivalents are calculated correctly based upon whatever decisions EPA comes to between now and the next reporting date early next year. The next step is to set up a reporting entity, which basically is information about your entity as a whole. Name, if it has a unique identification number, the reporting year that the inventory is going to be applicable to, and also the primary product that will be used for normalizing greenhouse gas emissions and a production measure. This is the primary one. You have actually the latitude a little later on, which we'll get into, to actually specify a secondary measure, and when we get to that point, I'll go into that specifics at that point. So, for example, standard production measures that are used by the system include, for example, for E&P operations, millions of barrel oil equivalents, refining, millions of barrel oil equivalents crude throughput or refining production, for transportation and terminals, millions of barrel oil equivalents throughput, for marine, millions of barrels transported cargo, for pipeline, million barrel miles, which actually follows, FERC guidance on that, and then retail, which is 1,000 gallons of motor fuel sales. So basically, you define this primary parameter up front, before you start actually inputting data into the system. Once your entity is set up, one then sets up the users. Well, SANGEA is set up in such a way that multiple users can, in fact, utilize the system at any time. You can see on the screen here, this shows two things. It shows a number of different contact names that have accessed a particular version of this. And also, the user setup includes the ability to view a user log, so that any time a user logs in, indicates who it is that's using the software, it'll keep track of when that occurred and whether any comments were added in by the user as to why they were accessing the file. Now, this doesn't provide what I'd call a bulletproof system of security for access to the system. It doesn't define, read-only versus read-write or administrative access. It basically keeps track of who has accessed the system when they log into the system to make any additions or changes to the software. Or not the software, but actually just the input information that you're populating the system with to calculate your greenhouse gas emissions. The next step is actually to go through and set up your reporting locations. Now, there's some important points here that one needs to keep in mind. SANGEA reports emissions for given locations, but these locations can, in fact, be managed under location groups, so that if you choose to, you can not only report location-specific emissions, but you can also report emissions for a group of operations. So, for example, if you have E&P operations, you have refining, you have petrochemical, you can actually organize things in groups and then the facilities under those groups. US EPA MRR reporting requirements tend to define reporting facilities as a location. But again, even if you do choose to use this to report under US EPA MRR, you still can then take individual location inventories and then aggregate them to report data at a higher level for your organization overall. Note that a location is a group of emission sources, each having the same company equity, operator status, and position. Each emission source needs to be assigned to a location. A location may correspond with a physical or geographical location, such as a town or facility, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Without exception, it's imperative that each emission source is associated with a location before you can begin to configure the individual emission sources. So this is how, and I'll show a slide which kind of illustrates the hierarchy of entity to location groups to location to sources in just a second. With respect to EPA MRR reporting, it also provides the ability to define sub-basins for subpart W reporting. Sub-basins must be unique to a location, but different locations can have the same sub-basin. This is when, during the setup process, you have the ability to define a secondary production measure if you so decide to do so. This chart illustrates what I've been talking about: entity, relationship to location groups, relationship to facilities, and then the sources and fuels that make up individual facility emission characteristics then flow into each individual facility, and basically this allows you to roll up information from the location level all the way to the entity level. You could use this to organize all company operations. However, you need to use a little bit of judgment there. If you're a smaller organization that has a limited number of operations, that will work just marvelously. If you happen to be a global major that has operations in several different business units and facilities all over the world, and you want to use this to roll everything up, you probably need to think carefully about how much of that information is incorporated in each individual SANGEA file. Obviously, as you add more information, it becomes more challenging to handle that information as the file gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But it is very, very capable to handle a good deal of information. After one has set up the the information on locations, one then gets into actually putting in some of the detailed information that's going to allow you to calculate your greenhouse gas emissions. In this particular case, we set up location-specific fuel types. Basically, for each reporting location, users select the types of fuels and the properties for those fuels for combustion sources and flares. In the case of the EPA MRR fuel types, you select the fuel types based on the regulatory requirements. In that particular case, those are Tier 1 to Tier 4 calculation methodology that's defined in the regulation. In the API Compendium, one can select any and all possible fuels that might be fired by a specific location. In the case of subpart W, there is also the ability to define or differentiate between field gas and flare gas. And for subpart Y, one can designate flare gas. Now, the whole idea behind this is to allow the user to maintain fuel property data and emission factors for all the combustion sources at a given location. However, there's also the ability to designate what would be termed a global fuel. Now, this is something you may want to use for two reasons. One, for users who operate multiple locations but use the same fuels for those locations, therefore not making sure that you don't have to enter the same fuel over and over and over again. The other situation may occur where you may only have limited fuel monitoring data, and thus you're using a consistent fuel type or fuel composition and characteristics for multiple locations within your operations. The software also includes a gas composition calculation tool, which allows you to enter the detailed fuel composition that is then aggregated into the template for the information needed to be able to calculate the fuel properties. You also have the ability, now I've been talking about this so far as we're entering information kind of fuel by fuel, location by location. SANGEA has the ability to import and export fuel data. So for example, if you have data in a spreadsheet that can be more readily uploaded into SANGEA, there is the ability to do that as long as those data are organized in accordance with how the data are organized within the Access database. Moving on to the next step, you then select greenhouse gas calculation protocols. Basically, users can select preferred protocols during the initial setup, thus API versus EPA MRR, or one can select these as one goes through and sets up each and every source within your inventory. Now, why might you want to do that? Well, clearly, if you're reporting through MRR, you're going to have to use the MRR protocols for sources that require reporting for greenhouse gas emissions. However, if you're also using the tool for the purpose of calculating a more complete inventory where there may be additional sources that are not covered by MRR, but those that you wish to include, say, for how you want to benchmark with in a more complete inventory relative to reporting through API, you then can actually specify that those be included. You will have then both of those in the system, and you can actually, when you report the data, you can obtain the information specific to MRR, or you can obtain the information overall based upon inclusion of the API protocols. Now that we have the calculation protocols identified, again, what I want to do is show you, just reiterate, the source modules, how they map into API Compendium, how they map into the various EPA MRR subparts, because you are basically going to have to step through the program to set up the specifics around each and every source module that you have, each and every source that emits greenhouse gases within your designated facilities.
I don't see pneumatics on that list, did you? That previous.
The next step.
I didn't notice.
The next step is to configure the emission sources under specific modules. Each module includes multiple emission calculation methods, and again, this is all configured as a wizard to help users set up emission sources very quickly. If you decide to specify source IDs, numbers basically, or designations, they need to be unique within a single location, otherwise the program will become confused and not necessarily give you the information that you're looking for. The user can specify the user-specified source parameters are stored in the software source database for future emission inventory calculations and reports. Now, the other thing, if you happen to have a source which is not specifically contained in one of the 16 modules, one of those modules is designated as a user-defined source. So you are then in a position to be able to designate that source and input that information into SANGEA for that specific source. There's a variety of ways in which information can be input into the software, but for example, say that you are producing gas offshore. That gas comes onshore, goes through a slug catcher, goes on to your various gas processing plants. And periodically you run pigs through the slug catcher to clean out any residual liquids that might have collected in the slug catcher and to keep the gas flow coming in from offshore. Your pig goes to a pig receiver. You have to open up the pig receiver and depressurize it in order to be able to remove it, to be able to use again to clean out the slug catcher. You may want to catch the potential emissions that may come off of that. That's one example of something you could actually add in as a user-defined source because it isn't specifically covered by the software. The next step with the user-defined sources is you want to enter source activity data. For each source, you will enter the data. It can be fuel usage, it can be annual operating hours, it can be source-specific carbon content, and many, many more things based upon the specific information and the specific sources. You can add in fuel properties for fuels data available for a specific location. Monthly fuel sampling data can, in fact, be specified, or it does, in fact, provide the ability to add in, put in the annual numbers and then kind of spread the data across the 12 months of the year if knowing information on a month-by-month basis is not particularly important to you. You enter your single source data, such as combustion emissions from a fuel type. Again, monthly activity data can be specified if, in fact, you have data on that basis. Now, we talked about multi-source data entry. And really what this boils down to is these multi-sources are designated to allow the user to enter source parameters for a group of sources. So it could be, for example, a group of tanks. It could be for equipment leaks, maybe for oil and gas venting, or sources, mobile or transportation sources. Now, in many cases, this is mostly for EPA MRR sources, but can in fact also be applied to certain of the API sources as well. There can be event-based sources. Basically, data entry for sources that are not operated routinely and where emissions occur on an event-specific basis. So say you have emergency releases that you quantify the emissions for. That would be something that you would need to enter release by release, and you have the ability to designate those event-based sources for the purpose of emission inventory reporting. Additional sources would include direct source emissions data. So for example, we've been talking about entering activity data, carbon contents and such to be able to calculate emissions based upon program formulas that require that information. Well, you may actually have data, source test data or other data that you wish to use for the purpose of your reporting. So for example, if you have data that are based on continuous emission monitoring systems, SANGEA provides you the latitude to enter that data specifically for those sources. Or say you decide to calculate your emissions from your glycol dehydrators using GRI glycal. You can basically take the results of those calculations or those measurements and put that information into the system as a basis for calculating your emissions. There's also location-specific production data that is entered as you go through the input wizard. Now, this is for, a couple of different purposes. In one case, certain of that data also needs to be reported to EPA as part of MRR reporting, but also putting that data into the system allows you then to, for API benchmarking purposes, to be able to calculate normalized emissions as a basis for reporting that data. From a source data input standpoint, this is a slightly different cut at the charts I've shown earlier. This shows the source modules. Again, includes a wide variety of modules specific to the industry: acid gas removal, dehydrators, equipment leaks, flares, hydrogen plants, liquid loading, oil and gas venting, refinery process units, stationary combustion, storage tanks, SRUs, combustion control, indirect emissions, a miscellaneous category which is specific to API, mobile and transportation emissions, as well as, again, the category of user-defined sources, should you have something which is not covered by the source modules in SANGEA. You can see here that many of these, and you see here how these map across the different types of sources: the single sources, the multi-sources, source events, and direct source emissions. Many of these can apply to both API and EPA protocols. A number of them are specific just to EPA. Flares, oil and gas venting as a multi-source, refining process units as source events, storage tanks under EPA, and then a number of them, as you can see, are also specific to API. The last 5 sources on the list are specific to the API protocols, and there's a couple of other API items in this chart as well. Now, last but not least, now that you've spent the time to put all this data into the system, you want to be able to calculate your emission inventory. Well, SANGEA 4.1 uses Microsor Reporting Services as a basis for generating various types of reports. The system currently includes more than 20 different reports that can be developed from your emission inventory. As you can see from the screenshot, the reports the reports category has the emission calculation tab that basically allows you to then calculate your emissions once you have all your data in the system, and then it has 5 different categories of reports that can be developed: source reports, an API summary report, an EPA MRR summary report, as well as reports related to subpart W and subpart Y. And what you'll see when I go through and kind of show you the software and what's contained in the software, there are multiple categories or subcategories of information that can be reported at more or lesser levels of granularity through each one of those 5 types of reports. You can select one report, you can use multiple reports. You also, when you do in fact create a report, you can actually export those report files into Excel spreadsheets and save those and use those for other purposes in terms of you using that information for other reporting or management purposes within your own organizations. To kind of go through some of the user-friendly features within SANGEA, again, when you set up, you have a wizard that walks you through the setup process throughout the entire software. You have the ability to select a single standard temperature for gas property calculations and emission factors, remembering that the emission factors in the system, and I'll show you this in just a few minutes, actually are in the system at both standard conditions. There's a calculation tool for gas composition properties and API gravity. The software provides source, import, and export tools that are in Excel spreadsheets for several common source types: combustion sources, oil and gas well venting, storage tanks. Use of Excel spreadsheets provides the capability for you to edit a large number of the same type of sources in spreadsheets and then import that into SANGEA 4.1. So if it turns out that you have information set up in such a way that doing that type of editing is going to be more efficient for you. You can do it offline and then basically upload it into the software.
I think it would calculate tank emission.
Additional user-friendly features include greenhouse gas, the fact that greenhouse gas results and source parameters can be exported to spreadsheets. So this allows the user to actually process results that may be required for regulatory or corporate emission inventory reports or management of greenhouse gas emission reporting, targets, goals, etc. And one neat capability is the ability for the user can copy from an existing SANGEA file for use in the next year. So at a minimum, this function will copy all source parameters from the existing file so that you can then take it and use it for calculating your next year's inventory. And then the user has the latitude to either have the activity data that's been input flow over to the new file, or you can basically strip out the activity data so then you have a clean file with all the appropriate location, source, location, entity, and source information in it. It allows you to then to incrementally correct those as necessary, as it's not unusual in the oil and gas industry for assets to come on the radar screen and go off the radar screen, so you need to keep that updated. But then also then to systematically add in the activity data for the new reporting year that you're going to be, for which you're going to be reporting.
Just let it do.
In effect, what that does, it streamlines the process of developing your greenhouse gas inventory from year to year. Okay, now that we've gone through the overview, again, it's relatively high level, but now what I'd like to do is to go through a demo of SANGEA. Basically go through the software and kind of show you what I've been talking about on slides and how that information manifests itself in the system. So give me a second here. What I will do is open up my SANGEA software. And by the way, if any of you at the other end, we should have sufficient time at the end to entertain a few questions, but we have a fair number of people on the call. One, if you haven't already done so, please mute your phones so others can't hear you if you're talking in the background. And secondly, what we can do is use the chat function to submit questions, and we'll go through as many of those as we can. And if we can't answer them or get to all of them, you know, we'd be happy to provide answers after the seminar is over with. So I've opened up SANGEA, and what I'm going to do is, you can see in the upper part of this menu here, it allows you to create a file, to open a file, to save as a different name to a file, so you can have a file and create a duplicate of it to use for other purposes. It allows you to copy from a current access file, but what we're going to do is simply open up a file and just take this this one right here. So there's a file that's been pre-configured. Now, once this happens, you can see one of the screens that pops up is the user selection. Well, my name doesn't happen to be on this, so I'm going to be Adam today. And as you can see, there's a comment section, so you can actually put in comments to indicate what it is you're looking to do during this session of accessing SANGEA. So I'm just going to type that in and basically close that out. So let's step through the system. First is entity information. In this particular case, we have the entity information, we have the reporting year, the primary production measure is crude oil in barrels, and that's, again, how this file was initially set up. We go to the user screen, and what we see with the user screen are the various names that we saw before. Now, again, if you have multiple people, if you have only one person using the file, then there's only one person who's going to be the user. If you have multiple people that may use the file, you may want to do this to keep track of things. And what the software does is create a user log. So this shows actually the genesis of this file. It dates back until actually last year. But you can see every time Adam got on to do something with the system, Adam's name is located. Actually, me now is Adam. And here's the comment that I put in. So you can see what's been done, who's done it, and when it was actually done to the software. Software has the locations in it. In this particular case, you can see there's 10 of them. Identifies the country, the state, sub-basin, category as appropriate. And also, at least for the purpose of API reporting, it has the ability to designate corporate equity share for a particular operation. The API protocol, the API Compendium, one has the latitude to work on both an equity share and an operational control basis. So if one chooses to want to use that for that purpose, one can define an equity share to be able to work from. And again, one has the ability in any of these screens, once you have set this up, you can enter new items, you can edit those. If you want to replicate characteristics of a particular location, you can actually copy those and create additional ones. Or if, say, your operation in ABC is no longer part of your operations in a given year, you can actually delete any of these. This system tab brings you to the fuels, and so what you can see here is a wide number of fuels that have been entered into this particular file for 3 of the locations. It designates the type of fuel, the fuel name, the specific protocol it's associated with, so you can see, for example, for those under the EPA protocol, you have them designated as Tier 1, 2, 3, or 4. One nice feature about this, for the purpose of, particularly when you're getting into making sure you've got all your information there and you're sort of systematically cross-checking and QAing information, or you're revising a file based upon subsequent use of an original file, you can actually sort these just by clicking on the title for the particular column. So you can look at things by fuel type, by protocol. You can look at things by location. And this capability exists for any and all screens where information like this is cataloged. Next level under system is sources. And here you can see, again, we have sources for Odessa, Permian, and Houston. A large number of sources, you can see. And again, you can look at these by module, acid gas removal, combustion control, dehydrator, equipment leaks, and a lot of others. You can organize them by location, so you can see what the Houston plant specifically has, what Odessa has, what Permian has. It also has things like oil and gas venting, flares, combustion control, depending upon the specific characteristics of those sources. And then moving now into the data input screens, basically each time one of these is clicked, this opens up to the facilities that have data. And you can see here that, for example, for the Odessa gas plant, let's take a look at a few of these. Let's take a look at field gas. Shows the carbon content, molecular weight, heating value, sulfur content, and the various compositional parameters. And actually, in this case, shows the data entered by month. Again, the software has the ability, if you just add in an annual average, it will then spread that across the 12 months if monthly numbers aren't particularly of importance to how you're actually choosing to catalog and collect your data. Let's take a look at another one, flare gas composition. So we have a slightly different composition there for the flare gas. Let's say Tier 3 gas composition. Again there, composition of the Tier 3 gas that's being used by your emission sources, and it shows the information on carbon content, molecular weight, heating value, sulfur, and composition for CO2 and other carbon-based molecules. Now let's look at location production. And we'll concentrate on Odessa, Houston, and Permian. You can see the production there is crude oil in barrels. Shows the data again, the production in barrels. And if you went into the rest of these, you would see similar information related to the production for those different facilities. We talked a bit about multi-sources, so let's go back to Odessa again and take a look at some of these. This is a tank, shows the annual throughput, dump valves not closing properly, methane content, CO2 content of the off gas. Let's take a look at, let's see, production, leak 2. Now again, these are multi-sources, so you're talking about here are different components that fall into this production leak. So you have valves, connectors, open-ended lines, pressure relief valves, shows the number of components and also the component emission factor that is being used for those specific components. Let's go to, let's see, let me see, associated gas. Let's do associated gas. So you have 2 wells. You have the gas to oil ratio, standard cubic feet per barrel of oil, and you have the volume of produced oil per year, so that information can in fact be calculated. And there was one other one I wanted to, unloading method. Let's go to this one here. Here we have wells with plunger lifts, wells without plunger lifts, with the requisite information to be able to calculate the emissions. Looking at data input for single sources, we'll go to Odessa again. We have tanks. We have acid gas removal units, in this case showing the CO2 content in the gas and the vent gas flow. We have a dehy, and we have a dehy flare, which shows the flare efficiency and the fuel usage. We also have a flare for associated gas, again showing the flare efficiency and the fuel usage. So again, all this information is input and then contained in the system for the purpose of calculating emissions. We talked about the ability to look at source events. Well, let's see, let's look at Permian, and in this particular case, we have a normal flare stack well. In this particular case, there were no events for that normal flare stack for this particular year, and thus there would not be information contained in the software file for that. And finally, data input for source emissions. And again, let's seem to like Odessa here today. So let's go to the glycol dehydrator. And this shows the basically CO2 and methane quantities. We go to AGR5. And again, this particular case, we have kilograms of CO2 being released. That will be rolled then into the inventory. So again, this just kind of shows the, what things look like in the system and the kinds of data that's contained within the system. Now, there's a couple of things up here that I want to show you. You have a couple of tools and show you the reporting. On the tools, one of the things that we have inside the software here is the subpart W reporting requirements by industry segments. So the industry segments include these that are listed. So if we want to look at, say, onshore natural gas processing, shows the source types, the related module in SANGEA, whether CO2 emissions, methane emissions, or N2O emissions, and CO2e emissions are required. We can go to underground gas storage, again showing the source types, the module, and the various emissions that are going to be reported based upon that. This even has natural gas, liquefied natural gas import and export. So you can see the types of information that's contained for that one. And again, it has this for basically all the various segments there that we might wish to do reporting under. There's also a tool which shows the emission factor tables. So you can actually go into the software, and for basically all of these sources, you can see what the emission factors are. It lists the factors, the segment. In this particular case, the particular source, it shows the segment, it shows the various emission factors, and as you can see, just move this over a little bit, you have the emission factors both at 60 and 68. And then it also, for each of these, identifies the unit ID and a reference. So in this particular case, this segment is from Table 5-2 of API Compendium 2009. Let's take a look at another one, API Emission Factors for Flares. Again, it contains all the information specific to that, showing the various gases at both 60 and 68 degrees. And again, it shows the reference of where that came from, in this particular case, Table 4.11 of the API Compendium. So you have the ability then to go in and look at those emission factors, and to the extent that you have, again, you have data that may indicate a different factor based upon source sampling or other measurements you may have taken, then again, you have the latitude to input that data and use that data versus the standard emission factors that are programmed into the system. Now, of course, software tool like this wouldn't be particularly useful unless you could actually calculate your emissions and actually report them. So when you have all your data in, you will go to this next screen and you will actually calculate your emissions. You can do it, you know, for all sources, or let's just say you can also focus it to specific location groups, upstream, midstream, gas plants, refineries, and terminals, or you can just say do it for all, and we're going to focus on the three categories of facilities that for which we looked at data. You then basically click the calculate button, and it goes through and does the calculation for all your emissions. Or say that what you want to do is to, you've just found out that EPA has changed the global warming potential. You can then go up front, you can change the number, the global warming potential for the gases, however they're changed, and then you can actually then calculate the emissions on either basis to see what the difference in your emissions are based upon that one simple change. You've now calculated your emissions, so now let's just do some reports. Let's do an EPA MRR report, and we'll do it by facility. Again, you can focus it to any single report, or you can do all of them. So you run the report, and there it is. That's the report based upon the information in the system. And if you wish to export that, you go to this menu up here, you can print, you can adjust the print layout and page setup, but this then allows you to export it to an Excel file. Now, of course, that file is in Excel. So let's go to, and there's your data in an Excel spreadsheet, which allows you to use that in for other applications. Let's get rid of that. Let's do a one more report. We'll do an API summary report, and we'll do it for production and performance by location. Again, remember what I said before is there's activity data in here, so it will actually print out data or produce data that shows the normalized emissions for what's been put into the system. So it has Odessa, Houston, and Permian, and then has data in this particular case. There's no API-related calculations for this one, but there is for Houston. And you can see it shows it on a year-to-date, a quarterly, and a monthly basis. And then finally, through the help, you get a link to the SANGEA 4.1 user guide, which is on the APISangea.org website. And this has the entire user's manual contained within there that you can access if you need to look up any information as you go through and develop your inventory. Let me get out of this and go back to the presentation and close the webinar. API has released SANGEA 4.1. It is available for purchase. Trinity is distributing the software for API, and you can access that either by visiting the APISangea.org website as shown on this slide, or email to support@api-sangea.org. Either way, whether you go to the website or just send it directly to that email address, it will get to us so that we can respond to your request. We provide support, which can be requested again through the website or through the support@api-sangea.org if you run into initial issues with downloading and starting to use your software. We also will be providing training courses. We do this both as public courses and company-specific training courses. We actually have 2 courses already scheduled, one in Doha, Qatar, and one in Kuala Lumpur in early December. Future training courses will be scheduled as needed based upon the numbers of individuals that choose to want to use the software. Again, to the extent you're a company that wishes to have multiple licenses, we can do training specific for your company. If you just have one and we have a number of people that we can get together for a public training, we will organize that and do that so that you can understand how to use the software in more detail. These training courses are typically 1 full day training courses, so we really go through the details of using SANGEA when we actually have that course. I'd like to thank you for participating in the webinar. If you have any questions, you can submit them through the support@api-sangea.org website, and we'd be glad to respond. And we will follow up the webinar with material from today's webinar and reference information that you will find useful. Thank you very much for participating today, and hope to hear from you about your desire to purchase SANGEA. Thank you.